Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 7 of the 8-week class. Congratulations for making this far. Congrats on getting your concert reports in. I'd like to say that, I guess that is a hurdle to get over, but we still got to push through. There's a lot of material in these next 2 weeks. And it's important that we stay on top of everything. And speaking of that, I want you to be mindful. There were a few people that didn't time the week well and ended up getting themselves stuck this past week. And so it's important that you get through these welcome videos early in the week. Now, I realize the problem is that if you're not one that's doing that, you won't see this, and that'll be problematic. But it's important that these are done as early as possible because you have to get through this video to unlock the next modules, and they work all in sequence. And where this is going to be a particular issue is when you get to test 3, which is coming up not this week, but next week, because those modules those test modules will not unlock unless you've completed all of the work. So that means you have to hit all the quizzes. You have to be able to get everything done for those to unlock. So hopefully you're watching this early, you're working through the materials, and you are getting everything done and done well so that those modules will all unlock for you. And I'm not getting panicked emails saying, I don't know what to do, because some folks have lost out on the tests because they hadn't gone through the work. It's been the same schedule since the beginning of the class. There is no changes. It's the same rhythm, the same patterns. Hopefully you had a great Thanksgiving. Hopefully you were able to carve out some time so that you could relax and enjoy the day and get work done around the holiday. But I purposefully kept all the timings of everything the same because there is a rhythm to the class, and I wanted to make sure that you were all good with that. So get these done early. Get through the materials, the book, and the online modules. I am having some of you still answering questions for the assignments, and it's pretty clear that you're not reading the book and or not going through the online materials. Another thing that seems to be happening, I'm gathering, is that some of you, I don't think, are listening to the music. Because if you're listening to the music, it would inform your answers. So I make the playlists not as a fun exercise on how to make a Spotify playlist. I make the playlists so that you'll listen to them. I include the videos so that you will listen and watch. That's the point of a music class. Yeah, it's stuff that takes place in history, but all within the context of the music, and without a doubt, it is the most important thing. So, with that said, make sure that you are really doing the work. I've got some of you that are trying to do these assignments without a book, I think, and not getting good grades because you're not being able to answer the questions in what I'm looking for. Okay, so this week, you have 3 chapter modules again. We keep barreling through to the end, right? So this week is an interesting one. You're going to have the modules on punk and new wave, the modules on disco and funk, and the modules on hip hop and rap, okay? So that's a lot of stuff that's going on. The thing that I want you to be mindful of is that all of this stuff that you're learning about is happening in the same time frame. We're pretty much mostly in the 70s now. You are going to learn a little bit with funk. We're going to go back to the 60s because James Brown was really kind of the guy that created that at funk, and that was in the 60s. You're also going to learn about some of the influences of punk, which came out of the 60s, particularly the Velvet Underground, the Stooges, and the MC5. Now, to that, those are really important influences to the development of punk rock. They were not punk rock. So when you are asked about, or when you will be asked, if it comes up about, important early punk bands, don't mention the Velvet Underground, don't mention the Stooges, the MC5, or the New York Dolls. None of those are punk. They influenced what would become punk. So You're going to learn about that. So let me just give you a kind of semi-quick overview so that you will be ready for everything that you're going to learn about. One other word of advice is, and I've put this in some of the assignments, but don't try to answer the question on the introduction. You know, every introduction, every chapter has an introduction. Sometimes it's in a different color. And so I have students in the past that are just like, they're trying to answer it off of that. Those introductions are doing kind of similar to what I'm doing here in setting context. They're not the answers to the questions. You actually have to get into the materials to get the answers to the questions. Okay. So punk was influenced by things that came out of the 60s. It was influenced by the Velvet Underground in their kind of DIY, do-it-yourself. They weren't necessarily the greatest musicians, although John Cale was pretty established. Their subject matter of their songs, they were writing about what they were seeing in the world that's around them, and growing up in New York and seeing the underbelly, the seedy sides of life, just like we learned about with some of the glam artists. So they were not punk in musical, they were punk more in ethos. Then you have the Stooges and the MC5, and this is where the sound of punk started to develop. Very loud, very brash, violent, angry at times. Not necessarily violent in a moshing way. That didn't really start yet. But in terms of just the way that they approached the music. So they both Stooges and MC5 were out of Detroit. They were influenced by the auto factories around them and the sounds of city life around them. Then you get to New York and you start to get to where punk starts. And there was a really important club called CBGB. And CBGB was important because it was basically this dive bar that some local musicians that were never going to get into the big fancy disco clubs talked to the owner, a guy named Hilly, into letting them play music there. And it ended up developing a scene, a really amazing music scene, because out of that scene, you had the New York Dolls, you had Television, you had Patti Smith, you had Talking Heads, Blondie, Ramones, all very different sounding bands. Some that would go to influence punk, some that would go to influence new wave or become the start of new wave. So CBGB's was really important, and the New York Dolls were one of the bands that led into that. They really modeled their musical influences off of a rough version of like 50s rock and roll. And the New York Dolls and Kiss were really like in the clubs at the same time, influenced by similar things, both what they wore, how they looked. There was a fashion and a makeup and all of that was part of the look of all of this. And really, New York Dolls were what influenced visually a lot of the hair bands that you'll learn about. So you have those bands that influence what becomes punk. And really punk starts to settle in with the Ramones in terms of the look and the sound, not so much the subject matter. A lot of the Ramones songs drew a lot from like 50s bubblegum pop, and there was a sense of humor to some of the lyrics and things like that. But in terms of the look, the speed of the music, the power chords, the anger, the aggression that would go on, that would go to influence bands, I mean, still to this day. So you have that. Then what happens is you have an English guy named Malcolm McLaren, who's over in New York from England, and he goes to CBGB. He sees these bands. He sees Television with Richard Hell, who's wearing shirts that are held together by safety pins and that are all torn up. He hears the Ramones. And he goes back to England, and he's a fashion guy, and he's got a shop on the King's Road. Up until this time, the shop was like a teddy boy shop. We learned about teddy boys. Those were the rocker kind of guys in England, so they modeled after the James Dean look and all of that. And he changed his shop to a shop called Sex, so you can imagine the kind of stuff that it sold. And he realized that to really propel his fashion and all the things that he was doing, it would need to be on the backs of music. Now, this is before MTV. I do want you to be mindful, MTV does show up in this later on, August 1st, 1981. Again, you'll learn about that more next week. But this is before all of that, and most of what you're going to learn about in here is before that, and I kind of try to keep that dividing line. So Malcolm McLaren ends up getting some local ne'er-do-wells that can kind of play a little and forms the Sex Pistols. And the Ramones, by the way, tour over in England and before their first album's ever out, and they influence a lot of bands. A lot of bands hear the Ramones and they start doing that. The Sex Pistols start playing, and the Sex Pistols become very influential. And there's this saying that wherever the Sex Pistols played, a bunch of bands would pop up over in England, and then eventually they toured over here in the States. The Sex Pistols were really only around for about 2 years, from 76 to 78, roughly. And then they were gone. That was it. And that's its own tragic story that you'll be learning about. But out of that, they toured here. Their tour ended in San Francisco. And by the time you get to 77, 78, the music scene changes dramatically, and punk starts to become a thing here in the States, particularly a scene that settled on the West Coast, and you're going to learn about that. In San Francisco, you had bands like Crime and the Avengers and the Dead Kennedys, so you're going to learn about the Dead Kennedys. And then hardcore punk really settled in here in Southern California. So the original punk scene wasn't really hardcore. It was a real mix of things, influenced by glam and the Velvet Underground and all sorts of different things. And then after a couple of years, it started to get violent, and there was mosh pits and people were spitting. Now mosh pits have kind of come to, they've become passe. I wouldn't be surprised at all nowadays if you had mosh pits at BTS concerts and Taylor Swift concerts, because it's sort of lost the meaning of it. But, it's a great way to go get beat up, and I've had my share of them growing up at this time. So then you're going to learn about, I focused some time on Southern California punk bands, particularly bands like Black Flag, Circle Jerks, X, The Germs. So you're going to learn about them, and even some very much more local bands to us in the class, with like the Adolescents and Social Distortion. So you're going to learn about those in the modules, some that are in the modules but not in the book. Or that I fill in a little bit. And then you're going to learn about New Wave. New Wave is something different. New Wave is not an offshoot of punk, even though it's often portrayed that way. New Wave was an approach to music in a different way. And so people say, oh, well, New Wave came out of punk. Did not. New Wave, really, the folks that started New Wave was Devo. And their first single came out in 1976. So they weren't really influenced by punk, because punk really wasn't a thing yet. They were approaching music in a very different way. And New Wave is really a catch-all term. There was a ton of great music that was coming out in the late 70s, and so much of it so fast that people didn't really know whether to categorize it, whether it was, synth music, or whether it was, neo rockabilly like the Stray Cats, all sorts of stuff that was coming out. And so they didn't really know what to call it. And so this term New Wave started to be called. And out of here, you have bands, like I mentioned, Blondie and Talking Heads, and the Pretenders. And then there was a British pub rock scene that Elvis Costello came out of. And just to let you know how broad this term was at the time, Tom Petty was considered a new wave artist when he first came out. Now, we think of him really more as classic rock or rock and roll or whatever, but he was very different for the time. And so that was considered new wave. Lots of different bands. And I included a bunch in the playlist, some of my favorites that are in there. But it's also interesting to listen to, because you really, if you listen to the playlist, you get a sense of how broad that term is. So you're going to learn about punk, you're going to learn about new wave. Then you're going to learn about funk and disco. Funk developed out of the 60s. If you think about the thread of black music that we've been learning about, and you think about rhythm and blues and how it got renamed rock and roll. And then in the 60s, you had Motown and you had soul, and which is all kind of falling into this rhythm and blues world. And then you have funk. And funk is very much black dance music. Pretty sophisticated rhythmically, and how it interlocks their correlations to music coming out of West Africa. And so you hear about, or you'll hear the way that James Brown really kind of changed musically. And when you listen to the music of funk, what you'll hear is very separated lines. The bass is doing its one thing, and it's really the driving factor in a lot of funk. drums are doing its thing, guitars doing its thing, horns if they're there doing their thing, vocals if they're there doing their thing. And collectively, it's like a puzzle, like a sonic puzzle that comes together. But it is dance-oriented music, and it really was made by Black people for Black people. And then disco came along, and disco kind of watered down funk. And even to quote Gloria Gaynor, she said basically disco was music that was simple enough that white people could dance to it. And so disco music is really where you get, if you listen to any sort of, if you go to raves or you listen to any sort of EDM, electronic dance music, and you hear that boom, 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 what we call the 4 on the floor beat, that comes out of disco. That's really where that gets going. Very simple, very basic, not complicated music. Like a lot of that. Its goal is to dance. Its goal is not to be some sophisticated listening experience. It started to become popular. It became very popular in the gay clubs, particularly New York, Studio 54, and other clubs. And then it just really exploded across the country and globally. There was influences from European production, like Giorgio Moroder. And it became ubiquitous, which is another great word here, which, you know, is all-encompassing. And I'll give you another good word here. You are on this is your next to the last week. So if you don't know this word already, the word penultimate. Penultimate means next to last. So there you go. Another extra word for you if you didn't already know that one. See? And at no additional cost to you. So disco became very big, so much so that TV theme shows were using disco, movies. It was a very big deal, certainly hit its zenith, I think, with Saturday Night Fever, and the soundtrack to that, which was a huge selling record and really catapulted the Bee Gees into a different level of fame, even though they had been around before that. So, and then there was a lot of people that hated disco too, because disco was very mechanical, very machine-like, and you know, the thing with disco was that it was designed to be in clubs and to play. They were mostly always the same BPM, beats per minute, and you could just segue one song into another song into another song. The club owners loved this one because, unlike having a dance band, they didn't have to take breaks. It would keep the people dancing, which would keep the people thirsty, which would keep driving them to the bars to buy more drinks. And so, you know, it was, there were a lot of people that hated disco for that. You're going to learn a little bit about the anti-disco sentiment. But there was a number of reasons why folks didn't like it. And then disco and funk and other styles, including hard rock, eventually lead us into hip hop and rap. Now, if you go back to the late 70s and you're going to learn about where rap comes from, where the hip hop culture comes from, it is very geographically specific. It actually comes out of one borough in New York, and you're going to learn about how that starts there, and then it expands through New York, and then it eventually starts to grow in popularity. And as radio stations start to pick it up a little bit, primarily Black radio stations, although later K-Rock and other stations play a role in that. And certainly then by the time MTV comes along, now it becomes national and then international. And so you're going to learn about hip hop. Now, hip hop was originally a culture term, not a music term. So if you were to go back in time to 1978 and someone said, hey, what kind of music do you like? You probably wouldn't say hip hop. If you did, they would look at you funny. Maybe we would say that. Now, rap was the style of music that was part of hip hop culture. Other things that were part of hip hop culture was the fashion, you know, the sweatsuits, the tracksuits, the Adidas, the gold chains. There was a look to it, right? There was a breakdancing was a really important component of that. Breakdancing was a way that you would have these friendly competitions, nonviolent competitions, kind of similar to what doo-wop did in the 50s. And then tagging the graffiti around, right? So that became part of the culture, that whole style. And it has basically become its own art form, although it was not really appreciated back in the day. And so all of this was part of hip-hop culture, and rap was the style of that. So rap has its roots in Jamaican music, actually, because of the DJ culture that came out of Jamaica. And the DJs would often get into this rhymed spoken patter that was known as toasting. And one of the important figures in rap was a guy by the name of DJ Kool Herc, who happened to be Jamaican. And he started to become more popular. They would make mixtapes, and they would use these tapes for breakdance competitions and displays. And as they would get the word out, and then the mixtapes would become popular, and people would want copies of the mixtapes, and then people would rap over them, and then eventually with Grandmaster Flash, you start to get really the 2 turntable thing going on. He was really one of the pioneers of that, and so then you start to get the DJ thing, the rap thing going in, and eventually you get to Sugar Hill Gang, Grandmaster Flash, and the Furious Five, Run DMC, Curtis Blow, Africa Bambaataa. I want you to pay attention to the early, when rap first came on, because it was primarily a force for social good, and then eventually that changed. And we'll see what brought about the changes by the time you get to Public Enemy and NWA. And the book doesn't go all the way through, just like a lot of our chapters. It doesn't take us all the way through to the end, to current day, rap, but it takes us into the foundations. I think it mentions Kid Frost and Salt and Peppa. It might mention Eminem and Tupac and Biggie a little bit, but it doesn't really go into them, because that's a little bit later. So we really, but that was a big shift when NWA, Ice-T, and Public Enemy come along. They change a lot about rap, and then it becomes really commercial and popular. And as you all know now, we've got these there's great underground rap rap groups out there, and artists, hip hop artists. And I think nowadays too, I think we would all probably agree that hip hop and rap are maybe, there's subtle differences, kind of like we talked about with hard rock and heavy metal, that you could talk about maybe the differences between them. And there's so many genres of rap; it changes all the time. The problem with rap is that it tends to largely eat its young. And so something will become popular, and then it will quickly be replaced. And just like you'll end up with Soulja Boy playing at I don't know, store openings and stuff like that, right? You probably all hadn't even thought about Soulja Boy in a while, have you? So all of these, I would say most all of these artists, they won't end up in the history books. Very few of them will. I think Kanye will. I think he's sort of earned a place. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what's Kanye, but there's a lot of them that aren't going to end up. They're sort of there for the time. And remember that just because someone's popular, a couple things. One, doesn't mean that it's good. And also doesn't mean that it's a game changer, that it's actually contributing, sort of to the furthering of the art form. And so if I haven't said this before, here's a little perspective for you. 1969. Now, when you think about 1969, the Beatles were still a band. Led Zeppelin was around. The Doors were around. The Who, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix. All of this stuff was going on. Amazing, amazing music and more. You've learned about so much of it. The Motown artists, the soul artists, so many great people. The number one selling single of 1969 was Sugar Sugar by the Archies. And if you don't know that song, go look it up. And in fact, maybe I'll put it underneath this video so that you can hear it. The Archies was from a comic book. So the Archies were a fictitious group, and this is about as bubblegum pop as you can get. Great tune, fun tune, dance to. But you think about all the great artists that were happening and great songs that were coming out, and that was the number one single. And the reason that I mention that now is because you may think now and go, oh, this artist is great and that artist is great. And it's hard sometimes because of the nostalgia thing. We tend to think of our favorites as though they're going to have some big, great thing. And that doesn't mean that they're not great artists or that we don't love them and they're not valuable artists. You may have already been wondering, like, hey, how come we haven't talked about this band or that band or whatever? Being historically important, contributing to the furthering of popular music is different than being popular. And I'm not going to mention any artists right now because I'm sure that you know who there are. But I would venture to say that 95% of the people that are on the top charts right now will not show up in history books. They rarely do. It's not until we get past it for a couple of decades that we look at, wow, they really, pioneered things. Okay, so that's a lot. This is a long one. I know these videos are long, but it's important that you watch them because it sets the context and I add stuff in that helps you. Please do good work. Make sure you're using the book. Make sure you're going through the materials. Don't try to grab stuff from outside because I want you to get all the points that you can get. Remember, the learning is what is important here. It's not about the grade. It's not about the piece of paper. It's about what you learn and how you apply it to your life. So that's it for now. Have a great one. Don't forget to answer the questions that have been embedded in this. Might be one now. I don't know. And we will talk soon. Have a great week. Bye.